He ruled the world. He fished with gold, burned Rome for pleasure, and cut open his own mother, just to see where he came from. What kind of monster sits on a throne? And why did he die begging for mercy? Let us gather by the fire and talk about Nero. Honestly, the man was as vicious as any fiend lurking down in the brimstone, but according to the old writers, he had this wide world completely under his thumb. East, west, south, and north, everywhere you looked, he was in charge. And his wardrobe, it was absurd. His robes were weighed down from collar to hem with glittering white pearls, heavy rubies, and icy sapphires. The man truly loved his gemstones. There was never an emperor more delicate, more pompous, or more bursting with pride. Believe it or not, if he wore a magnificent robe for just one single day, he would discard it. He would never so much as look at it again. He was so fabulously wealthy he had fishing nets woven from actual gold thread just to drag through the muddy waters of the Tiber River whenever he felt like playing around. His passing whims were the law of the land, and for a good long while fortune was his best friend. But his pleasures were, to put it mildly, twisted. He burned down Rome just for the sheer spectacle of it. One afternoon he ordered the slaughter of the senators, simply because he was curious to hear the exact pitch and tone of men weeping. He killed his own brother, he slept with his sister. And his mother, he treated her horrifically. He actually had her womb cut open just to see the exact dark corner where he was conceived. And the most chilling part of all, as he stood there looking at her ruined body, not a single tear fell from his eyes. He just tilted his head, remarked that she was a rather fair woman, and snapped his fingers for a glass of wine. He drank it right then and there, no remorse, just cold, pure cruelty. Now, in his youth, Nero had a tutor named Seneca. Seneca was the absolute flower of morality, a brilliant man who taught him literature and courtesy, essentially trying to teach a hurricane how to be polite. And as long as Seneca had his ear, he kept Nero out of the worst kinds of trouble. He sharpened the boy's mind, keeping tyranny and vice locked away. Seneca used to tell him, "Sir, an emperor must be virtuous. He must hate tyranny." Because of this perfectly reasonable advice, Nero grew to resent him. Nero absolutely loathed being corrected, so what does a spoiled emperor do? He forced his wise old master into a warm bath and made him bleed to death from his own arms. Seneca, knowing the monster he was dealing with, chose to die quietly in the water rather than face whatever creative torture Nero had lined up next. But eventually, fortune decided she was quite finished catering to Nero's towering ego. She was stronger than him, and she finally thought, "I am an absolute fool to prop up such a vicious little man and call him an emperor. I am going to pull the chair right out from under him." So one dark night, the citizens of Rome finally had enough. They rose up. When Nero heard the roar of the mob, he slipped out his back doors all alone, cloaked in the shadows. He scurried to the grand houses of the men he thought were his dearest friends. He knocked furiously on their thick wooden doors, but the louder he cried out, the faster the deadbolts clicked shut. Standing alone in the cold streets, he realized his terrifying mistake. He had entirely misled himself. He did not dare call out a second time. He could hear the people rumbling up and down the cobblestones, carrying torches and shouting, "Where is this false tyrant, Nero?" He practically lost his mind from the terror of it. He prayed piteously to his golden gods for a rescue, but the sky remained silent. Desperate, he ran into a garden and threw himself into the dark brush to hide. There, near a great crackling red fire, he found two rough men sitting in the dirt. The mighty emperor of the world fell to his knees and begged them to slay him. He pleaded with them to strike off his head right then and there, just so his body would not be dragged and mocked through the streets after he was gone. But they refused. Out of options and out of time, he finally took his own life. And fortune, she just watched from the wings, laughing at the game of it all. Then there was Holofernes. Let me tell you, there was never a captain under a king who beat more kingdoms into bloody submission. Nobody was stronger on the battlefield, nobody had greater renown, and honestly, nobody was more pumped up on his own press. Fortune just kept kissing his cheek, parading him up and down the world, right until his head was chopped off before he even woke up to realize it. The entire world was terrified of him, not just because he would burn their wealth and steal their liberty, but because he rode into town and forced every last man to renounce their religion. He demanded they worship King Nebuchadnezzar as God and no one else. Nobody dared to breathe a word against his command. Except, of course, for one stubborn, fortified city called Bethulia, led by a priest named Eliakim. But pay attention to how the mighty Holofernes met his end. One night he lay completely dead drunk in his command tent. And this was no modest camp setup. This tent was as large as a country barn, reeking of spilled wine and leather. Yet for all his pomp, his guards, and his heavy armor, a lone woman named Judith slipped right past the flaps. He was fast asleep, snoring flat on his back. She calmly struck off his head, tucked it away, and sneaked right back out into the cool night air, carrying his head all the way home to her town. A quiet, efficient end to a very loud man. And what about King Antiochus? I do not even need to waste breath explaining his royal majesty, his massive pride, or his venomous works. There was no one quite like him. He loved the sound of his own proud voice, but his fall from luxury was utterly wretched. Fortune had puffed up his ego so much that he honestly thought he could reach up and pluck the stars from the night sky. He believed he could weigh mountains on a scale and hold back the crashing floods of the sea with his bare hands. But above all things, he hated God's people. He wanted to slay them in the most exquisite, tormenting pain imaginable. When word reached him that his top generals, Nicanor and Timothy, had been soundly thrashed by the Jews, his hatred boiled over into madness. He hastily hitched up his golden chariot. He swore maliciously that he would drive straight to Jerusalem and drown the city in his anger. But his road trip was cancelled very abruptly. God struck him for his threats, smote him with an invisible, incurable wound that cut and gnawed right through his gut like a hot knife. The agony was unendurable, and honestly there was a poetic justice to it, given how much pain he had caused to the guts of so many other men. But even writhing in agony, Antiochus was too stubborn to hit the brakes. He commanded his army to march. Suddenly, before he could even shout his next order, God crushed his boastful pride. He was thrown so violently from his speeding chariot that the rough ground and splintered wood chewed up his skin and broke his limbs. He could not walk, he could not ride. His mighty warriors had to haul him around in a carrying chair, his back and sides a tapestry of deep purple bruises. And the vengeance did not stop there. The rot set in so deeply that wicked worms actually started creeping out of his living flesh. He stank so horribly that none of his loyal servants could stomach standing near him, whether he was awake, asleep, or screaming. He wailed and wept in the dirt, finally figuring out that God, not Antiochus, was the lord of every creature. The reek of his decaying body was absolutely loathsome. No one could bear to carry his chair another inch. And so, drowning in his own awful stench and horrible pain, the great Antiochus died wretchedly on a lonely mountain. A fitting reward for a man built entirely of pride. Now, the story of Alexander the Great is known to anyone who has ever lingered near a tavern fire. Anyone with a shred of sense has heard at least a little about his luck. He won this wide world by sheer, brute strength, or in some cases, kings were simply so intimidated by his terrifying reputation that they packed up their gold and begged for peace before he even drew his sword. He brought down the pride of man wherever his boots touched the ground, all the way to the dusty edges of the earth. You really cannot compare him to any other conqueror. The earth practically quaked in dread when he rode past. He was the absolute flower of knighthood, overflowing with what the old writers called leonine courage, the heart of a lion and the thirst of one, too. Fortune made him her favorite golden boy. Nothing could distract him from his high goals of war and glory, except perhaps a good vintage of wine and a beautiful woman. I could sit here and list off Darius, along with 100,000 more kings, princes, dukes, and bold earls that Alexander trampled into the dust. As far as a man could ride a horse or walk on his own 2 feet, the world was his property. I could praise his knighthood until the sun comes up, and it still wouldn't cover half of it. He was the son of Philip of Macedon, the first king of Greece, and he reigned brilliantly for 12 years. But oh, worthy, noble Alexander, what a profoundly tragic end. You conquered the ends of the earth, only to be poisoned by the very people pouring your wine. Fortune took your lucky dice and rolled snake eyes, and she did not shed a single tear as you fell. Who is going to help me complain about the death of such a generous, spirited king? He held the whole world in his hands, and even then he looked at it and thought, it is not quite enough. I blame false fortune and I despise that poison. Those 2 treacherous things are the root of all this woe. Then there was Julius the Conqueror. Through wisdom, sheer manhood, and a terrifying amount of hard work, he rose from humble beginnings all the way up to the glittering heights of royal majesty. He won the entire West by land and sea. Sometimes he took it by the brutal strength of his legions, other times by a very clever treaty. He made them all empty their pockets to pay tribute to Rome. And soon enough he became the emperor of Rome himself. Right up until Fortune got bored and decided to become his enemy. Oh, mighty Caesar, you fought in the dusty plains of Thessaly against your own father-in-law Pompey. Family gatherings must have been tense. Pompey brought all the glittering knights of the East. But your hardened soldiers took them down and slaughtered them, leaving only a scattered few to flee for their lives. You put the entire East into a state of absolute awe. You could thank Fortune for sweeping you along so perfectly. But let us take a second to pity poor Pompey. He was a noble governor of Rome, but he had to run for his life from that battlefield. And wouldn't you know it, one of his own men, a sycophant looking for a promotion, chopped off Pompey's head just to win a little favor with Julius Caesar. He carried that bloody prize right to him, alas Pompey, conqueror of the East, ushered to such a grim, dark end by the shifting winds of fortune. So Julius marched back to Rome, riding high, soaking in his grand triumph. But you see, Brutus and Cassius had always watched his rise with bitter, envious eyes. They huddled in the shadows, whispering, weaving a very subtle conspiracy. They picked the exact marble stones where he would die, and they sharpened their daggers. One bright day, Julius went to the Capitol, just like he always did, thinking he owned the world. And right there, among the towering columns, this false Brutus and his pack of conspirators surrounded him. They rushed him, they stabbed him with their hidden blades, leaving him gasping with a dozen deadly wounds. But the old stories say he only groaned at the very first strike. Maybe the second, and then silence. Julius had such a deeply manly heart, and he loved his own dignity so fiercely that, even with his life spilling out onto the cold marble, causing him terrible agony, he reached down. He took the edge of his heavy mantle and cast it carefully over his hips. He wanted to make absolutely sure no man would see his private parts. Even as he lay there fading into a trance, knowing for a dead fact he was breathing his last breath, he still remembered his modesty. You have to respect a man who cares about his appearance while being assassinated. If you want the full, bloody story from beginning to end, go brush off copies of Lucan, Suetonius, and Valerius. They will gladly tell you how Fortune was a warm friend to these 2 great conquerors at first, before turning into an icy foe. You just cannot trust her favor. She is a shadow, you always have to watch your back. Take the filthy rich Croesus, the king of Lydia. Even the mighty Cyrus dreaded him. But Croesus got himself caught squarely in the trap of his own towering pride. Men dragged him to the stake to be burned alive. But just as the flames licked his toes, a massive, miraculous rainstorm poured down from the sky. It killed the fire and let him slip away. Now, a smart man would take that as a sign to retire. But Croesus, he did not have the grace to beware of his luck. He kept pushing right until fortune finally strung him up from the gallows. You see, once he survived that fire, he just couldn't stop himself from launching a brand new war. He honestly thought he was invincible. He figured, if fortune sent a personal rainstorm to save me, no mortal foe could ever put me in the ground. And then he had a very strange dream. A dream that made him so proud, so gleeful, that he set his entire heart on absolute vengeance. He dreamed he was sitting high up in the branches of a grand tree. Jupiter himself came down and scrubbed his back and sides. And Phoebus, the sun god, brought him a fair, bright towel to dry him off. Oh, his chest just swelled with importance. He hurried over to his daughter Fanny, who was sharp as a tack, and asked her what this magnificent vision meant. She looked at him and explained it plainly. She said, "Father, the tree means the gallows. Jupiter dropping water on you, that betokens the snow and the rain. And Phoebus with his clear, warm towel, well, those are the sun's rays baking you. You are going to be hanged, father. The rain will wash you and the sun will dry you out." She warned him flat out without blinking. And sure enough, the proud King Croesus was hauled up and hanged. His royal throne, his gold, his miraculous luck, none of it could save him. You see, that is the very definition of a tragedy. It is simply fortune striking down proud, comfortable kingdoms with a sudden, devastating blow from the blind side. The exact moment men decide to trust her completely, she fails them, hiding her bright, smiling face behind a dark cloud. Oh, noble, worthy Pedro, the glory of Spain! Fortune held you up so high in majesty, people really ought to mourn your piteous death. Your own brother chased you right out of your lands. You see, there was a field of snow with a black eagle in it, caught by a lion as red as a burning coal. A wicked little nest brewed up all this villainy. This was no true knight taking heed of honor on a fair battlefield. This was a corrupt, greedy man who brought a worthy king to absolute ruin, all for a bribe. You were betrayed in the freezing cold of a siege, led blindly into a tent, and your own brother slaughtered you with his bare hands. All just so he could sit on your throne and collect your revenues. And then there is the other Pedro, the worthy king of Cyprus. You won Alexandria by sheer mastery of war. You brought a world of woe down on the heathens. But your own loyal lieges grew incredibly envious of your gleaming chivalry. For absolutely no other reason than petty jealousy, they sneaked into your bedchamber in the quiet hours of the morning and murdered you right there among the pillows. That is exactly how fortune steers her great wheel, sweeping men straight out of joy and plunging them down into the mud of sorrow. Look at the great Barnabo Visconti of Milan. He lived as the god of delight and the absolute scourge of Lombardy. You climbed so high up the ladder of power, but your brother's son, who, in a twist of tangled family trees, was also your son-in-law, threw you down into his dark prison and left you there to rot and die. I do not even know the exact method of how or why you were slain, only that family dinners must have been incredibly awkward. Now let us lower our voices a bit, because the agony of Earl Ugolino of Pisa is a story no tongue can tell without breaking down in pity. Just a little ways outside the bright city of Pisa, there stands a grim, cold tower. They dragged him and threw him into that stone prison, and with him went his 3 little children. The eldest boy was barely 5 years old. It was an act of absolute cruelty to shove such helpless little birds into a heavy iron cage like that. He was condemned to die in the dark. A bishop named Roger had spun a web of false accusations against the earl. It whipped the people into a frenzy, making them rise up and toss him into the cell. They gave him almost no meat or drink, barely enough scraps to survive on, and what little food they slid through the bars was poor, rotten, and bad. One quiet day, right around the hour his meager food was usually brought, Ugolino heard a sound that froze his blood. He heard the jailer shut the heavy, outer doors of the tower and throw the deep locks. He heard it clearly echoing up the stone stairs, but he didn't say a word. A dark, suffocating thought fell over his heart. He realized they were not coming back. They were going to let him die of hunger. He buried his face in his hands and cried out, "Alas that I was ever born." And the hot tears started falling from his eyes. His youngest son, who was only 3 years old, looked up, pulling at his clothes and said, "Father, why are you weeping? When is the jailer going to bring our pottage? Don't you have a single tiny morsel of bread saved up? I am so hungry I can't even sleep. I wish to God I could just sleep forever. Then this terrible hunger wouldn't creep into my stomach. There is nothing in the whole wide world I want more than bread." Day after day in the freezing dark, this little child cried. Finally, exhausted, he lay down in his father's lap. He looked up and said, "Farewell, father, I must die." He kissed his father's cheek, closed his eyes, and passed away that very same day. When the woeful father saw the life leave his boy, he was so overcome with violent grief that he lost his mind. He started biting and gnawing at his own 2 arms, screaming into the dark. He cried out, "Alas, fortune, I blame all my agonizing woe on your false spinning wheel." His surviving children, huddled in the corner, saw him bleeding. They thought he was biting his arms because he was starving, not realizing it was a madness born of absolute heartbreak. They crawled to him and said, "Father, please don't do that. Eat the flesh off of us instead. You gave us our flesh when we were born, so take it back. Eat enough to survive." But there was no surviving that tower. Within a day or two, the remaining children laid themselves down quietly in his lap and they died as well. And Ugolino, completely hollowed out by despair and grief, finally died of hunger surrounded by his boys. That is how the great Earl of Pisa ended. Fortune cut him right down from his high, sunny estate and buried him in the dark. If you want to hear the story told at greater length and perhaps with a bit more poetry, go read the great writer of Italy named Dante. He can tell it to you point by point, without missing a single sorrowful word. Thank you for listening to this story. Narrated with Aura Reader.